Welcome back to another video. If this is your first time here and you want to learn web development and become a better coder, start now by subscribing and clicking the bell so you don't miss anything. Alright, so in previous video we've looked at whitespace and we've reiterated some of the stuff we've already learned about HTML elements and CSS element selectors. In this video we'll learn about CSS element selectors versus class selectors. So basically we've got the first example right here, and looking at this first example we can discuss styling our block level elements. The example itself is very simple. We have an h1 element followed by a div, and as we've already learned, both the h1 and the div are examples of block level elements. Now inside this div there's a nested span element which is an inline element, and once this wrapping div is closed we have two paragraph elements, two p elements right here, followed by another wrapping div inside of which we've got one p element and another nested div. The reason why I'm showing you exactly this HTML structure in the example is because in the CSS side we have three element selectors. We have an h1 element selector, then we have a div element selector, and a p element selector. Now if we uncomment the div selector by commenting out the h1 selector, we'll get this look. Finally, if we commented out the top two selectors and uncommented the p selector right here, we'd get this look. That's all there is to this example. Nothing fancy, nothing special. But it's a demo of how CSS element selectors work in practice. And now we'll move on to the next example to see how we can use CSS classes to style our HTML elements. We'll begin by styling block level elements with CSS classes. The example itself is very similar to the previous one, but the difference is that now we are using CSS class selectors rather than element selectors. And here's our code that we can have a look at right here in the HTML. We can see that we've got this addition here that we didn't have previously in any HTML tags. And this is what's known as an HTML attribute. In this case, we've got a class attribute that we're adding to this h1 tag, and we're adding a value to a class attribute, and this value is in double quotes. Now, the way that we define this value is in CSS like this. We have a dot, and this dot in CSS is the same thing as the class word, the class attribute inside HTML. And then we've got the value that's passed into the class attribute. So basically, this is our target, and this is the selector in the CSS that is targeting this attribute right here. So the difference between the first example that we had at the beginning of this video and this example is that, contrary to the CSS element selectors, which target specific HTML elements, a CSS class selector targets a matching value that sits inside a class attribute of any HTML element. What this means is that now we can simply add a certain value to our HTML's class attribute. For example, we can add another definition and we'll call it, let's say, bold. So we have the bold class and we'll give it the font weight of bold. Alright, now we've got two classes. We've got the plum class, the border 1 class, and the bold class. And now you can see the benefit of using classes. Besides having the border 1 specified here, we can now also add bold, and what that's going to do is it's going to affect this thing right here. Of course, since the h1 is already bold, maybe it's better to put it in a paragraph so that we can see the effect right here. So the benefit to the class attribute and styling HTML from CSS using attributes, class attributes, is that we can mix and match CSS classes on any element, and we can chain multiple CSS classes on the same element. In general, we can mix and match our CSS classes on whatever element we want. So in this example right here, for example, to toggle the border on an element, we just add or remove the value of border 1 to the HTML elements class attribute. So for example, if we wanted to remove the border from this p tag, we can simply erase the border 1 class attribute. And that's it. So we can add more than 2 values to our class attribute like we are going to show right here. So we've got border 1, we've got plum, and now we're going to add bold, and that's the effect that we get. This brings us to the end of this video, and we can quickly go over some conclusions. So basically the conclusions are: we can add a class attribute to any HTML tag. Using class attributes in HTML is just a different way of tagging text on our web page, the process of tagging text that we've already seen in the previous 2 videos in this video series. Now any of our elements can have some additional information provided in a class, and we can provide as many class names as we want to our class attribute. Just remember that we need to separate class attribute values with a space character. As far as the CSS goes, the conclusions for CSS are as follows. To tell to CSS that we're targeting a class attribute in an HTML element, we need to put a dot in front of the class name. We follow it up with the actual class name, and the formula goes like this: dot, class name, and then as many property value pairs as we need. We can feel free to stick to only 1 property value per class, or we can have more than 1. That's it for this video, and in the next one we're going to do something very interesting, and that is we're going to control document flow using the display property with CSS and HTML.